Alright guys, it is time to finish up Unit 7, The Rise of the Dictators, and today we're going to focus on Japan, specifically the rise of militarism in Japan. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, where's the dictator? Because we've looked at Mussolini, we've looked at Stalin, and then Hitler. Who fits that description for Japan? And Japan is a little bit more complicated. Rather than focusing on just one person, we're going to look at the military itself and how it was eventually going to take over Japan and rule it all the way through World War II. So let's talk about how and why the Japanese embraced such aggressive nationalism and militarism as we finish up our unit. Alright, so to understand what happens with Japan and its rise towards a militarist power, let's go back to the 1930s for a second. So in the 1930s, you have a group of Japanese we're going to refer to as ultranationalists, okay? People who are extreme nationalists, people who believed that Japan was basically the alpha race in Asia and destined then to take over as much land in Asia as possible. And so if their message is we've got to go out there and expand and take over territory, the biggest question, of course, is, well, where should they gain this territory? Where is the next place they should go? And that is going to be Manchuria. So remember, Korea was already under Japanese control. This had occurred way back after the Russo-Japanese War. And now they're going to expand even further into this area called Manchuria. And Manchuria seemed to be a good place for Japan to expand from the perspective of ultranationalists for two major reasons. One, it's a big territory, and so much like how Germany under Hitler had claimed that they needed some living space to spread out, so the Japanese could also claim that as well. And Manchuria has a lot of natural resources that Japan needs, because Japan, the islands of Japan are actually rather resource poor, and by taking Manchuria, they can get their hands on oil and copper and coal and all those other things they need to become even more industrialized. But how do they get their hands on Manchuria? That's the big question, because, actually, let me go back to that. Manchuria was not its own country at the time. Manchuria was part of China, and so that means you're literally going to carve off a piece of an independent country. And how do you do that if you're Japan? And that brings us to what's known as the Manchurian Incident. So in 1931, this is 8 years before the Nazis invade Poland to start World War II, Japanese soldiers blow up a Japanese-owned railroad in Manchuria. And they're doing this so they can blame the attack on China. They can say, well, hey, we're the victim here. I can't believe China has attacked our railroad. What were they thinking? I guess we have no choice but to attack them. And so claiming self-defense, the Japanese army invade and take over Manchuria. And they turn Manchuria into a puppet state called Manchukuo. So by puppet state, I mean that officially it was an independent country, but in reality it was controlled by the Japanese. They took orders directly from Japan. And if you have a puppet state, that means you need a puppet ruler, and that was Puyi. Puyi, you may not remember this guy, but he had been the last Chinese emperor when the revolution occurred to end the monarchy in China in the very early part of the 20th century. And so he was seen as sort of a legitimate face on this puppet government for Japan. Now you might be thinking in the back of your mind that, wait a minute, you're talking about one country attacking another country and just taking land for them? I thought there was an organization around to prevent that, and I thought it was called the League of Nations. And you'd be right. There was the League of Nations, and they were designed to prevent this type of aggressive conquering. This was not a legitimate war from anyone's real perspective here. But the League doesn't do anything. They protest against Japan, saying, please don't do that. Please stop hurting China. Don't do that. That's mean. But they don't actually attempt to stop them with any substantive actions. Now, Japan says, you know what, I don't want to be criticized by the League of Nations anymore, and so they left. They simply left the League of Nations. And they also announced to the world that, you know what, we're not going to limit the size of our Navy anymore. We're going to start building more battleships, more destroyers, more warships, And obviously, that is a big threat to us. So here you see Japan firing their artillery through all these agreements and then hitting China over here. Kellogg-Briand Pact, remember that was the attempt to ban war by preventing offensive wars? Well, yeah, Japan's not going to listen to that anymore. So now let's put the militarists securely in charge of Japan. And this is going to occur in 1937. In that year, the government of Japan was basically taken over by the military. And democracy, which had been in place, is basically weeded out and thrown away and replaced with what were seen as more traditional values. And so the militarists preach a warrior code that the Japanese were supposed to live by. They build a cult of personality around the emperor. In this case, Hirohito was his name. And so the emperor is elevated to a godlike status. And I don't mean figurative, I mean literally godlike status. And they were taught, the Japanese were, to give absolute, undying, unquestioned obedience to the state. So you might remember that in 1931, Japan had taken over Manchuria from China. But the militarists that ruled Japan decided that wasn't good enough. And so in 1937, they launched the Second Sino-Japanese War by attacking China. And you might recall that China was in the middle of a civil war at the time. And so this was a great chance to take advantage of that and take land from China because China was so distracted. You might also remember the atrocities committed by the Japanese in China, like the infamous rape of Nanking, or Nanking Massacre. Okay, now, obviously, most countries around the world were watching Japan's actions, and they were horrified. They were like, oh my gosh, what are they doing? Why are they acting this way? But there were some countries who looked at this and said, yep, that sounds right to me. I wish we could be doing that too. And of course, I'm thinking about Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. And so in 1940, Japan teams up with those two countries to form what's known as the Tripartite Pact. And of course, by 1940, World War II is already underway in Europe anyways. And so this is kind of a preview of what America is going to have to face when they get into the war in 1941 by fighting all three of these countries. A couple of examples of cartoons here. Obviously, very concerned about what's going on in the world. We've got Japan, Germany, and Italy all joining up together. And it looks like maybe the world, the Allies can't quite stop them. This one shows us the Tripartite Alliance, and you've got Hitler, you've got Mussolini, and you've got Tojo, who was the basically the military dictator of Japan, leader of the military government. All right, so that was it, guys. I know that was a rather quick video compared to the other three, but a lot of what we need to cover with Japan, we'll cover more so when we get to World War II. And in fact, now that we're done with the Rise of the Dictators, Unit 7, we are ready to get into World War II proper. So in Unit 8, that is exactly what we'll be doing. We'll be covering World War II from start to finish.